I call the member for Hasluck.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise to support the Stronger Futures in the Northern Territory Bill for 2011. And I want to acknowledge the comments made by the member for Page, because I think she made a very salient point in the fact that a learning process occurred for her within the interactions of some of the Indigenous leadership that sat around that table, but not only Indigenous, non-Indigenous people whose contribution have been significant to the debates over the last probably decade. But there are many others in the past too who have contributed to some of the direction setting that has occurred in Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities. And to some extent, this bill proposes some key reforms that I think are fundamental for the change and shift in the way that services are delivered, but also in creating the opportunities for people within those Northern Territory communities to become a part player within the process of the reform. Certainly, I would argue that when we take this to the next stage, and the next stage is the part that concerns me, and that is the red tape that applies in the way of regulation and guidelines that will be applied, because it is there that the intent of parliaments and the intent of ministers become murkied by the interpretation in the application of initiatives that are fairly broad within this. And certainly I would support that if we do anything at all, that if we want to make a difference, we have to involve Aboriginal communities as equal partners in the process of reform and change, where they can sit and have access to information and knowledge that enables them to make informed consent decisions collaboratively with senior bureaucrats who will be sitting with them. I note the Senate, Mr Deputy Speaker, is doing a series of consultations, and it's a pity this consultation is occurring after this bill is being introduced into the chamber. I would have preferred to have argued that we consult first, frame the legislation, so that we had a process embedded that would require government agencies in working through these solutions and implementing them, that they be imbued into the mindset of those who deliver. Change through legislation doesn't occur easily. There is always a time lag. But anywhere where you have an equal basis of decision making and you contribute to the debate in the way that you shape and form both your own aspirations, the direction setting that comes with the legislation, then it is much more enduring, much more effective. And I commend the Minister on certainly focusing on some key areas, particularly the alcohol and substance abuse element, because alcohol, taken in moderation by any individual, is a good relaxing agent. It enables you to lose some of those inhibitions and at least have conversations. But I think the other challenge is when it becomes a destructive byproduct that harms and ruins families and communities. And certainly I would support those measures. In terms of land issues, we've never really had in this country the debate to the extent that we are now, where the consultation will talk about the subdivision of Aboriginal lands to enable families to build homes of their own in communities and where they have lived for some time. In fact, what we've done, and this is all governments have done this, we have entered into housing programs, put them into place and then expected change to occur. But we've got to remember that we have the oldest living culture that has never really lost many of the threads and elements that have been significant and important. And to that extent, change does bring conflict. Change also brings about a disproportion in the way in which engagement and planning occurs. I think the cultural practices that have prevailed for long and have at times been used as a reason not to proceed should never prevent the fact that people need to sit face to face and work through the issues and to reach real solutions that makes effective and efficient use of the resources that Commonwealth, state and territory governments provide within the context of the change that is being mooted. I also would urge very strongly that in respect to the provisions in the Act to do with alcohol and the control around the distribution of alcohol and some of the measures also has a better evaluation process built into it, so that when we implement a framework for change, a framework that will reduce the abuse of alcohol, and also the way in which we hope these changes will be significant in improving the outcomes, that we evaluate the things that work, that we take best practice where best practice can be used by people within those communities to determine how effective their community will take forward measures that will make a difference. In reading the bill, I was quite heartened by the fact that there are some constructive aspects to it. The enforcement of food security has always been a concern that I have witnessed and seen over a long period of time, and certainly in my own experience there have been communities where when you walk in the community store, and being in health you try and encourage community stores to provide a nutritious range of foods and yet having the balance. But you also encourage community stores to be effective in providing an avenue for food on a regular basis. And often I've read stories or have been involved in discussions where a community store has collapsed because the manager has been problematic. And so a community then has had to struggle. I think that these three elements of alcohol, the housing and community land approach, and certainly the food security and community stores are two very critical areas that, three critical areas that for some time have languished. And I anticipate that if we do this well, then, and let me say from a bipartisan perspective, and in fact in this House tripartisan, that the approach of it is a common approach and it has that support. We'll see the type of changes that we all have argued for. Certainly when I listen to Noel Pearson, Mick Goodar, and many other leaders around this country who have argued for reform that sees the security of pathways for not only just Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities, but for families and children, so that we break that nexus of the ills or the dysfunctions and we strengthen the role of the family within the community. And I see elements of that in this if it is implemented in concert and in partnership with. I made reference to informed consent decision making. I think that is one of the things that is missing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. What we tend to do is we establish the legislation, we develop the programs, or we cobble together many of the programs that exist and look at how we better deliver them within those circumstances. And while the intent is good and it is driven from Canberra, it nevertheless is an imposition of a framework on top of people whose daily lives are often influenced by those who make decisions from afar. And if you want change, and let me just reflect back on the Reformation period in the history of our own civilisation as a world, that when people had access to knowledge, had access to information, then they were able to influence their destinies, participate in them and become strong in being a voice within that process. I think that we as Australian governments over the periods to come have to adopt a different approach. I think in the apology, the former Prime Minister said if things aren't working, then let's look at alternative solutions. Let's look at different ways of doing business. And I would hope that those elements within this bill are considered in that context, because I can see that at the end of a 10-year moratorium for a couple of the areas that are referred to, that change will not be as significant as we would have hoped for. No community, no family, and no individual have really progressed when you provide a nanny state framework. If you empower them to become the shapers of their own destiny, if you empower them to be part of an equal decision-making process, and if you give them the capacity to change what is their circumstance, but you provide the support from the expertise of the agencies that prevail at both Commonwealth and state level, then I think we will see real and meaningful change. And I am optimistic that there are many elements of this bill that will achieve that. And the thing that I was heightened by were other matters, information about criminal history, because I can take people to reports in which the criminal history of some individuals running Aboriginal communities or running community stores has not been a factor that has helped any community at all. I think the other thing that we have the opportunity of doing is to build the human capacity of those within communities to contribute to the shaping of what is delivered within their community as well through this process. It is the front end, in many aspects, to significant reforms that can occur within education and health. The only thing that I find slightly distracting is when we apply a whole of community approach to income management. Because let me say, there are people within those communities whose income management skills are equal to that of any other person that lives in this country. And I would rather see us give more focus to providing some upstream work around the understanding of financial literacy, understanding of budgetary processes and budgeting, understanding of the costs, and then working that through. But I don't reconcile from the fact that this legislation will support those who have aspirations for their children, those who want the circumstances in which their families live and reside to be better than what they currently are, to provide the pathways to a home environment in which there is the support and love that leads to educational opportunities, leads to a place where they feel safe and comfortable, that alcohol is not a factor for the abuse that some experience. That this legislation, or that this bill will provide the legislative framework that will enable some of the change that is needed. But I would ask that the Minister give serious consideration in the implementation process for her relevant agencies to look at the implementation nature and the way in which state and territory and Commonwealth public senior officers negotiate and work with communities. I would also ask that the Minister consider the outcome of the detailed consultations that will occur in the Senate inquiry, that what they bring back from the messages from Aboriginal community, and I've seen this in the media reports, that there is some anger about the lack of consultation. There is an expression that is often used in Aboriginal communities of seagulls who fly in and fly out but never leave a solution. They talk and then disappear. I would hope that we don't attribute and contribute to that concept in the implementation of the programs that support this bill. But I do, Mr Deputy Speaker, support the Stronger Futures in the Northern Territory Bill 2011. I think that we have the opportunity in a tripartisan approach to make an incredible difference in working far more effectively with the Northern Territory Government, and certainly far more effectively with Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. I commend the bill to the House.